Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. Although this week it is just one guy and a stack of comic books. Mike is a little indisposed this week, but wanted to keep through and go through our weekly What is in the Stack. Mike will be back next week, but wanted to run through what we thought were the best and most notable comic books of the week. And today, I'll kind of lead with there were some great books this week, but there's two sort of major disappointing books that were released this week, and I think it kind of just shows Marvel is at a weird kind of fluctuation point with some of their books. And so the two books I'm going to talk about at the top. Uncanny X-Men number 13, and then The Amazing Spider-Man number 1. Um, Sadly, both of these books are disappointing, but for different reasons. Um, Uncanny X-Men's an interesting book in that, after the Krakoa era, they had an opportunity with this From the Ashes initiative to kind of come out, new group editor, new writers, new books. And sadly, the X-Men seem to be running into the same exact issues that have caused these comic books to kind of go off track the last couple of years. And that this is the 13th issue of Uncanny X-Men. And while this issue itself is not the main problem, if you kind of look, we've had 13 issues so far of X-Men. Three of them have been tie-ins to events that are happening in other books. So we had there was the Road to Gray Malkin book, which you needed to buy the main X-Men title to get all four parts of that. We had 2 issues ago in issue 11, there was the X-Manhunt event, which was regarding Professor Xavier. You needed to buy 7 other books to get that. And this was not something where with this issue, you could just pick this up and understand what's going on. It drops you in the middle of the event. So largely, if you just pick up Uncanny X-Men, you really don't know what the heck is going on with the book. And then the other problem that we had, and this is the symptom of this week's issue, while Gambit and Rogue feature in this book, there is a ton about a new character that we've never met before. And on this group, I believe they call the Outliers, which are these 4 new mutant students that have been recruited in this book. Now, if you look at the cover from the first issue of Uncanny X-Men, you kind of notice that's a classic team. Sadly, in this book, you rarely see them inside the book outside of the covers. And Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Jubilee have a very, very small role in this book. And the thing is, it's another issue with X-Men where we have so many mutant characters. We have so many characters that have just infiltrated all of these books. And yet, even in the main title, they cannot give us even a semblance of the recognizable team that we have. And while there have been some good issues, I think the debut issue of this, the first issue, is actually really well written. The art on the book has been better than to be expected. David Marquez was on it, and he's done a few more issues than I would have thought he would have done. But we still keep running into the same issues with the X-Men. We have so many issues of this run already infiltrated by tie-ins. So we're not even a year in. We've already had 3 issues that are tie-ins where you need to buy 4 or 5 other books just to know what's going on here. You then have so much page and panel count being given to these brand new characters who, to be honest, are just unremarkable characters. It's nothing that they're like broken or terrible characters. But again, it's just why on such a key book like Uncanny X-Men are they so hesitant to give us any semblance of the actual X-Men characters that we came from? And the thing is, Marvel themselves know this. When you put this team on the book and you look at the majority of the covers, they feature that team, feature Nightcrawler. They're trying to sell you with that, but they have no intent whatsoever to actually give you a fulfilling story with Wolverine, with Nightcrawler, with the Jubilee, or anything like that. There is a lot of Gambit and Rogue in the comic, and so basically what this comic book is, Uncanny X-Men is Gambit and Rogue's married book, where they have mutants that they're trying to train. And it's just disappointing because this is such a key title for Marvel. It's not even necessarily that this book is poorly written or that the book just doesn't go anywhere. I'm not a huge fan of it, and I will say I think 13 is probably the exit off point for me in this book. But it's just disappointing again. This is Uncanny X-Men. This should be the premier Marvel Mutant title. And there is so much page and panels dedicated to new characters that just don't seem to be hitting whatsoever. And I know, Marvel's talked about wanting to make sure that they create new stories. Tom Revort's come out and said, he didn't want to give people a classic lineup of characters because, X-Men is more about trying to branch out and create new IPs and things like that. But it's just such a disappointment that they continue to, because you don't have a classic X-Men setup with this. You've got them in New Orleans. They're kind of branched off. They're against Cyclops' team quite often. We have a very different place that the mutants are in. They had a chance to really do something interesting with this. And instead, it's another book where you pick it up, you barely see your favorite characters, and it's all about these new characters and their dynamics and what they're going through and their journey and and that's just not as interesting. That's what books like The New Mutants are for. That's what books like X Factor are for. That's what books outside of this main title. This should be the premier book. This should be where you get the adventures of your main X-Men characters. And this is again just an example of Marvel failing to provide that. It's sort of like if you would go to a restaurant that serves pizza and just every third time you go, they're like, hey, we don't have pizza tonight. You have to pay the same price and we're going to give you something else, but you don't get the pizza. And it's just, you don't see this from other businesses. You don't see people who do this. And I think when you have a rotating artist group, they're not that they're bad, but again, no consistency in art. And now they're not even giving us the characters that we want because they're trying so hard to push these new characters when we already have probably 20 or 30 too many X-Men characters as it is. Because we already have characters like Colossus who aren't really anywhere. And that's the thing is they've branched off so many of these characters into so many different books. It's just really weird to see what they're doing. And so, really wanted to like Uncanny X-Men. I was really unhappy with Krakoa, but I wanted to give this a fresh start. I think this is probably the ramp off point for me with X-Men, but just disappointing to see the same errors happen over and over and over again. And I don't know why it is that they cannot provide a consistent, solid X-Men book where you can see the actual characters that people are buying these books for, instead of having so much time and so much space dedicated to books, characters that largely seem like they are just self-insert characters for the writer or characters that they wanted to wish existed in X-Men. And it's just something where it's like, it's not what we're there for. It's sort of like if you would make a new James Bond movie and the movie barely featured James Bond and instead featured a brand new character who was going to dominate the screen for 50% of the time at the expense of James Bond. No matter how interesting that character is, at the end, you're going to look and go, I came to a James Bond movie. Why is this what we're doing? And so it's just sad to see that. I was really hoping X-Men could turn around, but this From the Ashes initiative seems to be, at this point, at least somewhat of a disappointment. They've had 3 or 4 titles canceled already. A lot of the miniseries they announced didn't really hit because we know with Marvel and DC, if we have a series that's a miniseries that hits, they extend it. Kind of like we've seen DC do with the Martian Manhunter Absolute comic and with Green Arrow, both of which were supposed to be 6-issue series and instead got extended to, either 12 issues or ongoing issues. Just disappointing overall. If you're an X-Men fan, would be interested to see, what do you guys think? Is the book actually hitting for you guys? It just, again, seems to be a position where Marvel can't really give what they told you they were going to give from the covers and the solicitations. And I think it's just a weird thing in there. If they put those Outrider characters, the 4 new characters in there, they wouldn't sell a book. The only reason these characters are in a book that's moving any copies is because you put the Uncanny X-Men label on it. You put Rogue, you put Gambit, you put Wolverine, and in all honesty, they're kind of window dressing in the book. The book seems to be focused on these newer characters. And it's sad because that's what books like New Mutants and stuff should be for, or NYX. And instead, they're taken out with the Uncanny X-Men. So a disappointing turn there. Again, it's not that it's a horribly written comic book. It just is another missed opportunity for Marvel, in my opinion, where you have a really easy home run book and you take a weird path with it. The other disappointing one is Amazing Spider-Man #1, and I'll say the same things on this. This is not a poorly written comic book. Pepe Larraz actually does some really good art in here, and I do think he is going to be a good Spider-Man artist. And so I do think there's some potential to this. But basically, this #1 issue is a repeat of a comic book from 16 years ago. This is exactly the brand new day Spider-Man that we got, I think 2007, 2008, down to, there's literally a recreation in this comic book of about the first 5 or 6 pages of Peter Parker going on interviews because he's unemployed again and, missing out on the interviews because he gets to run out and be Spider-Man, which is something I believe that Dan Slott did in Brand New Day about 16 years ago. And so we've literally taken Peter to where he is on a treadmill. Peter is not going anywhere as a character. We're literally retreading ground from 16 years ago. And the thing is, I'm sure there's some readers who will pick this up, and this is maybe their first foray into Spider-Man. And so for them, they may not know that comic book. But it is sad that even within 2 decades, the repeating storylines, and especially because, they want to talk a lot about how, they don't want to retread old ground. That's why they don't want to give us a Mary Jane and Peter Parker who are married. They don't want to, get him in a long-term relationship with Black Cat or, go back to some of the classic Spider-Man stuff. But, literally, hey, unemployed Peter montages, we'll run that track back as much as possible. It's not a horrible comic book, and I do think Joe Kelly's going to have some potential as the writer on Spider-Man. I've always liked Joe Kelly's work. I think he does write the character pretty interestingly, but it just seems like editorial does not want Peter doing anything interesting. And so while this is not a horrible comic book, certainly for a number one that you hope would really grab you, it just doesn't really have a lot because you kind of have seen this before. The only positives that I will say with this, there is a pretty decently choreographed fight between Spider-Man and the Rhino, and some interesting things that are happening there as far as what happens with the Rhino and Peter having to save the Rhino's life and investigating that. And I do think there's some story potential with that. But for a number one issue to literally be retreading ground from the same book 15 years later, it's just a little bit disappointing, especially because you would think with Amazing Spider-Man, again, the flagship title, probably the most important comic that gets released by Marvel, maybe the most important comic in the comic book market, period. You would really think that they would have some sort of new, bold, new approach to it. And again, it seems like, hey, let's roll out a storyline from 15 years ago that people didn't even really love back then. Maybe it's because the new movie's being titled Brand New Day and they want to kind of push that storyline. Again, it's an interesting decision from them to go that. So 2 disappointing books from Marvel this week. Really weird to see Marvel just with 2 huge titles seemingly just take weird paths. And again, it's not that the books are awful. It's not to say that these are like just horrible comic books. I'm sure there's people who read these and enjoyed them. But the problem is when you have such huge flagship books and you seemingly just have no direction and repeat the same problems over and over again, it's just a really disappointing place for Marvel to be in. So those are the 2 kind of key sort of books that came out this week that I think, some disappointing things happening there. I will say, even though I am a DC Comics fan and it might come off as bias, I think DC had a pretty good week at the shop this week. I think DC is doing some really great things. The DC issue that was best this week, Batman and Robin number 20. Philip Kennedy Johnson is just doing a really, really good job on this book. What I like that Philip Kennedy Johnson does, and this book does an interesting thing where Bruce Wayne kind of finds like his father's journal. He had lent that to Damian, and so they kind of do a couple pages where it's Thomas Wayne's journal and he's reading through it. And then you sort of have Bruce, he finds Damian's kind of own personal journal and kind of sees what's going on with Damian. The art's a little interesting, but again, it's supposed to be Bruce reading the journal that Damian has. But the interesting thing that it's doing is it's really juxtapositioning Batman's relationship with his dad, Thomas Wayne, and Bruce's relationship with Damian, and kind of showing that Damian wants to be a little bit more like Thomas Wayne than he does Bruce Wayne. And I think there's some really interesting dynamics that are at play there. What I like that Philip Kennedy Johnson has done with this is too often the Batman and Robin book just kind of feels like it's the lesser version of the main Batman title that just sort of guest stars Robin. What I think he's really done an excellent job at since he took control of this book, and I think it was 5 or 6 issues ago that he did. This truly is a father-son dynamic comic book that exists. There is just as much investment in Bruce as there is in Damian. It really feels like it's exploring that relationship really well and kind of showing how these 2 individuals who have very similar backgrounds kind of are so different and yet so together. I thought it's been great. And one of the things that I think he's done such a good job at, it's one of the first times I've ever cared about Damian Wayne as a character. Damian's kind of a tough sell. He was sort of just kind of thrust into the Batman mythos, and he has his fans, and I don't hate Damian, but he never really hit at the same level as like Dick Grayson did as Batman. I think even Tim Drake, at least early on, Tim Drake hit a lot better. But I think this overall has really shown the potential of Damian as a character, shown the Bat family dynamics. And I love when you have a comic book that can write Bruce consistently to where he still feels like Batman, but he doesn't kind of go into that Bat jerk territory they often go to with him. He feels like a dad who is struggling with how to deal with his teenage son, kind of go through with it. And there's still enough action in the book. There's still enough mystery. There's still enough intrigue. It's not just overall a huge drama. I will say this is a more dialogue heavy issue. So if you want some great action, this may not be the best comic book, but he's delivered on that. Kennedy Johnson has in the previous issues. There's a lot of great character building and stakes. I would say if you really want a decent Batman book in the main continuity, this is really, really solid. Philip Kennedy Johnson's doing a great job there. He's done a pretty good Hulk run. Hulk came out this week as well. It's not bad, but I really think this is where he's really in his wheelhouse. He's doing a great job with that book. Also, this week, Batman had Batman Dark Patterns. Dan Waters on this with, I believe it's Hayden Sherman on the art. I got to give this Dark Patterns book a lot of credit. It's nothing hugely remarkable, but it is just a solid Batman story. This kind of deals with Scarface, the kind of ridiculous puppet villain that Batman has. But I think the plot that they wove and the intricate way that he's done this series is sort of, I believe it's kind of like a 3 or 4 issue vignette. So there's about 3 or 4 of them that are together. I just think Dan Waters has a good voice for Batman in the book, and it's a great entryway point for folks where if you're a little bit out of Batman, you don't feel like buying all 5 or 6 titles, and you just want something that's going to be a solid, reliable Batman adventure. I think this really delivers on it. It's got a good mix of intrigue in terms of a mystery, some good action, some decent writing, and I think that Waters has a really good voice for Bruce Wayne as well. So it's pretty cool to see 2 great Batman titles on the book at the same time. Batman as a character has so many books. And so it's really cool to see a couple that have sort of differentiated themselves to where Batman and Robin's a great father-son dynamic book. And then this one is more just, hey, if you want classic Batman where you could pick it up, not worry about canon, not worry about where's this take place or what's going on, and just kind of get the Batman you want, that's a great book to pick up. The headline Batman book from this week is going to be Absolute Batman #7, which is another book that I think is actually pretty good. And I think this is by far the standout book of the Absolute Universe so far. This sort of does the Absolute Universe's take on Mr. Freeze. While not the greatest issue, I do think there are some cool developments. It deals with the aftermath of Bruce's friends, who are traditionally the villains in the main universe, finding out that Bruce is Batman. I think they balanced that pretty well and kind of took it to where there's some interesting directions that could go. The introduction to Mr. Freeze, I won't spoil it for folks who haven't read it. It is a little different, but again, the Absolute Universe is supposed to be a little bit different. I think it's still really well written, and I will give Scott Snyder credit that he does. I think freed up from canon, he can take a little more swings, and that may end up benefiting for him as long as he doesn't go too outside the box. But I do think this was a pretty intriguing issue. I think it's got some cool elements to it. The only concern that I have, well, the art is okay in this comic book, and I'll try to kind of pull up a decent splash page here. It's good. It is a little concerning that we are on our 3rd artist through 7 issues. This is, I believe, the #1 selling comic book coming out right now from DC, up there with Ultimate Spider-Man, and that we're already on a 3rd artist through 7 issues is a little bit concerning. I would still say it's good, but it's just sad that even on a premiere book like this, we still can't get consistency to where you're seeing the same artist over and over again. But I would definitely recommend it. I do think it's worth reading if you want to check that out. Last couple of books I'll talk about here today. Aquaman #4, Jeremy Adams and I believe John Timms on the art on this. I got to say, it's just great to see Aquaman back on the stands. I think they are delving into some interesting things, and I do think the art in this is pretty good. There's a lot of good story structures and things going on. They've sort of thrown Aquaman into this sort of wide conspiracy where he's got to figure out what his role is, and he's got some unknown enemies. It was kind of cool. I believe it's Lori, the girlfriend of Superman, the mermaid that Superman dates, is in this as well. So it was good to see that old character. I think one of the cool things that this is doing, though, is it's just embracing Aquaman as a character. It really feels like Jeremy Adams has the ability, sort of like Jeff Johns, to go in and write any character and kind of just get to who the heart of the character is. Jeremy Adams did a great job with Wally West on that. He's done a great job with Hal Jordan, and I think he's doing a really solid job with Aquaman as well, kind of getting to the heart of who Arthur Curry is. If you're an Aquaman fan, I think this is a book that's just going to, is it anything spectacular? No, but it's going to be you seeing the character as you expect in an interesting situation. There's enough action and intrigue. And I think the strength Jeremy Adams has as a writer is his dialogue is always really good in these comic books. Nothing ever feels forced. There's not an overly tremendous amount of exposition. The pace of all of his comics move at a good rate. And so it's just really cool to see Aquaman have a good, reliable book on the stands again. I think if you've checked out and you just want a cool entryway point to go in, it's pretty nice to see. There's also some cool touches about his relationship with Mira in the comic book. After Absolute Power, Aquaman's powers got messed up a little bit. So there's some interesting dynamics happening there. But overall, I think this is a solid series so far. Kind of reminds me of like Moon Knight at Marvel, where it's nothing where you're going to walk away from it going, man, that's the best comic book that I read. But I do think if you just want reliably solid superhero entertainment, it delivers. Book of the week for me continues to be Geiger. And I think Geiger number 13, you kind of deal with the appearance of this female character who essentially has the same powers as Geiger. Found out in the last issue she was kind of lying about the doctor who had she said had passed away, but she was actually keeping him captive. And what I have to say about this book, I don't want to spoil too much of it because I think if you're not buying Ghost Machine comic books, you really should go check it out. There's so much good art in this book from Gary Frank. Just the world that Jeff Johns has built out with these characters and what he's established in this universe. It's so much fun to read. There's great appearance from the Junkyard Joe character, which if you haven't read that 6-issue series, I would absolutely recommend to do so. But he's built such a cool universe with so many characters. In less than 20 issues, he's really built this entire dynamic of characters that you really care about. There's always great action. There's always great intrigue. There's enough dialogue, though, that you get what's going on without it feeling like just over exposition. It is such a reliably solid comic book with Geiger. And I think the same thing's happening with the Red Coat. And hopefully when we get Rook Exodus back, I just continually am impressed every single month with what they're doing at Ghost Machine. It's so sad to see these creatives who could be and were long-term DC guys, take all that creativity somewhere else. Great for them that they've done so, though. And I'm so glad we have a book like this on the market. But it just shows the talent that these guys have and what they can build. Really, really solid comic book. I would absolutely recommend this. If you are not picking up Geiger and you're a little disappointed with modern comic books, cannot recommend that high enough. It is such a great comic book each month. Last two, Mike's not here, but I do want to make sure I mention the facsimiles that came out this week. That's where Mike's sort of passionate. So two really cool facsimiles. Star Wars #1. Just great to see that on the stands in the facsimile format. First time I've been excited about anything Star Wars coming out in a while. But really great to see this, the old school kind of Star Wars facsimile approach to it. Just great to see all these. Marvel and DC always do such a good job with the facsimiles and the reprints. And then we also had Superman number 233, classic Superman cover. Just great to see both of these kind of lovingly reprinted. You get that, sort of great mix of the Curtis Swan art and everything in there. Just fantastic to see both those on the stands. And so if you're a facsimile fan, two great ones that came out this week. So if you aren't happy with new comic books, you can at least go pick up these two classics. And as always, folks, let us know what you think below. Mike and I will kind of respond both to the comments. Mike should be back next week with what's in the stack. But as always, let us know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, folks. God bless you. You have a great weekend.